The bitter cold of the English night was a living thing, a creeping mist that seeped through the thickest wool and settled deep in the bones of the city of London. It was a cold that felt ancient, carrying with it the damp of the Thames and the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten winters, a cold that seemed to whisper of older, darker things slumbering just beyond the edge of mortal understanding, and it was on this night, the 5th of November in the year 1605, that a secret began to unfold, a secret that would forever twist the known threads of history into a new and terrifying pattern, a clandestine operation born of religious strife and political desperation that was, unbeknownst to its conspirators, about to become the pawn of a far greater, more malevolent force. In a shadowy, low-ceilinged cellar tucked beneath the House of Lords, a space rented under the false pretense of storing coal and winter fuel, a man named Guy Fawkes, his face a grim mask of determination in the flickering light of his lone lantern, moved with a quiet, rehearsed urgency, his hands, calloused from years of soldiering on the European continent, carefully arranging the final barrels of gunpowder into a monstrous, towering stack that promised a firestorm meant to obliterate the king, the entire government, the aristocracy, and the very heart of the Protestant nation itself in one cataclysmic roar. The plot, conceived by Robert Catesby and his band of Catholic gentry desperate to end the persecution of their faith, was perfect. The 36 barrels of powder were in place, the fuse was ready, concealed behind a screen of ordinary-looking firewood and coal. And the hour of destruction was almost upon them, timed for the next afternoon's state opening of Parliament, when King James I and his heir would be seated directly above this very spot. But what Fawkes did not know, what he could not possibly have conceived as he wiped a bead of sweat from his brow despite the chill, was that he was not alone in the profound darkness of that underground chamber. The shadows themselves seemed to congeal and shift with a purpose that was not his own, and a presence, far older and infinitely more cold than the English winter, watched him from the deepest recesses of the room. A figure so preternaturally still he seemed like a part of the ancient stone walls himself, his eyes a piercing, luminous blue like frozen stars, burning with an ancient and malevolent intelligence that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires long before the first stone of London was ever laid. This was the Night King, a being of legend and terror from a time long forgotten, a creature of the deepest, most permanent winter, who had slumbered for centuries beneath the frozen northern wastes of a land not found on any map, awakened now from his eons-long slumber not by a sound, but by a sensation, a faint, distant vibration of impending chaos, a promise of a great, concentrated death, of a political vacuum and a nation's terror that he intended to intercept, twist, and claim for his own dark purposes of ushering in an age of endless ice and silence. As Fawkes, his task complete, checked his timer one last time, a smile of grim satisfaction playing on his lips at the thought of the righteous blow he would strike for his faith, a voice, thin and sharp as an ice shard and seeming to come from all directions at once, sliced through the silence. "Your mortal fire is impressive," the voice whispered, a sound that seemed to freeze the very air in Fawkes's lungs, and he spun around, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, his hand flying instinctively to the dagger at his belt. But he found himself frozen in place, not by fear alone, though that was a torrent within him, but by an unnatural, invasive cold that suddenly gripped the air, frosting his breath into a thick cloud and crackling over the gunpowder barrels with a sound like breaking glass, sheathing the dark wood in a glistening, rapidly growing layer of hoarfrost. "But it is a fleeting spark compared to the eternal winter I shall bring," the voice continued, melodic yet utterly devoid of warmth, and from the gloom, the Night King emerged, not with a step, but with a glide, his pale, fleshless skin seeming to glow with an internal, moon-like luminescence, his armor appearing not as forged metal but as jagged, impossibly intricate plates of black ice that seemed to form from the very moisture in the air around him, coalescing into a form both terrifying and eerily beautiful. Before Fawkes could cry out, could move, could even form a coherent prayer, the Night King raised a skeletal, elongated hand, and the world around Guy Fawkes dissolved into a screaming, localized blizzard of impossible cold. The gunpowder, the fuse, the lantern light, its flames snuffed out not by wind but by the absolute negation of heat. Everything in the cellar was encased in a thick, perfectly clear, crystalline layer of ice in an instant, preserving the scene like a fly in amber, a macabre monument to a tragedy that was never allowed to happen, with Fawkes himself trapped mid-turn, his expression forever locked in a rictus of shock and terror, a perfect statue of a man who had glimpsed a power beyond his comprehension. With his would-be destroyer neutralized and the explosive potential of the gunpowder rendered inert and harmless by the all-consuming deep freeze, the Night King turned his gaze upward, through the stone ceiling, towards Westminster Palace, where King James I, unaware of how close he had just come to utter annihilation, slept soundly in his royal chambers, surrounded by guards and the illusions of security. A new and more terrifying plot was now born in the frozen silence of that cellar, not of gunpowder and treason, but of ice and ancient, soul-chilling magic, for the Night King, in his ancient cunning, did not merely wish to kill the king. That was the crude ambition of mortals. He intended something far more sinister and perfect. He planned to take the king's place, to wear his face and rule his kingdom from within, and from that throne of a powerful, unsuspecting nation, he would slowly, methodically unleash a winter that would never end, a silent conquest that would spread from England across the entire world, extinguishing the fires of life and civilization one by one. The first step of his grand, glacial design was to ensure that the world believed the gunpowder plot had been foiled by the brave and cunning King James himself, a brilliant monarch who had miraculously discovered the traitors and saved the day, a story that would grant him unquestioned loyalty, divine right, and absolute power, the perfect disguise for a monster waiting to freeze the world. A narrative he would craft himself using powers of illusion and mind-clouding frost. As the first feeble rays of the dawn began to paint the sky over a London going about its business in blissful ignorance, the Night King, a spectral figure of ice moving unseen through the waking city, began to weave his new history, manipulating the thoughts of the guards stationed near Parliament, placing vivid, convincing images in their minds of a need to check the cellars, leading them to discover the frozen tableau and the traitor Fawkes, standing guard like a sinister sentinel, while simultaneously placing the grandiose idea of the king's own brilliant cunning and divine inspiration into every head from the Lord Chamberlain to the lowliest street sweeper, a pervasive whisper on the psychic wind, all while the real King James still slept in his bed, warm under his blankets, oblivious to the icy doppelganger that now stood in the shadows of his own palace, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to make the switch, to encase the true king in a tomb of ice and step onto the throne to claim the crown as the first sovereign of an endless, silent night. The transition was not one of violence or dramatic struggle, but a thing of silent, creeping horror, a perversion of nature executed with a precision that spoke of the Night King's ancient and patient malice. As the first true light of dawn, grey and weak, filtered through the leaded glass windows of the royal bedchamber, it did not fall upon the sleeping form of King James Stuart, a man known for his learning, his stubbornness, and his very human fears, but instead, it illuminated the culmination of an unspeakable act, for the being that now occupied the royal bed was a masterpiece of frozen deception, a perfect simulacrum carved from living ice and cloaked in an illusion of flesh, warmth, and breath, while the true king, the man who had ruled Scotland and now England, was gone, not dead, but captured, his essence and form imprisoned within a block of absolute zero ice that now stood in a forgotten, sealed-off subcellar deep beneath the palace kitchens, a prison known only to the icy usurper who had placed him there, a trophy and a source of power to be slowly drained. The Night King, now wearing the face and form of James, opened eyes that for a fleeting second still blazed with the blue fire of his true nature before the glamour settled, softening them into the familiar, slightly watery gaze of the monarch, and he drew a breath, not because he needed air, but to mimic the rhythm of the life he had stolen, and he rose, feeling the unfamiliar weight of a mortal body, the softness of the bedding, the residual warmth of the room, all sensations he found utterly alien and deeply contemptible, yet necessary for the grand deception he was to enact. A king of winter who had not survived the plot, but had stolen it, and with it, the future of all mankind. The silence that followed the public celebrations was, for the Night King, not a void but a canvas upon which he could begin his true work, the meticulous and patient unmaking of a world. Each day that passed with him ensconced in the royal chambers was a further degradation of the natural order, a subtle bending of reality to his frigid will, and the changes, once subtle and dismissible as an early winter, began to deepen and accelerate in ways that stirred a primal unease in the heart of every Londoner, for the frost that had merely nipped at the petals of late-blooming roses now clung to the city with a tenacity that defied the weak autumn sun, etching intricate, invasive patterns on windowpanes that no fire inside could melt, and the Thames, that great artery of trade and life, began to slow its flow considerably, its surface thickening daily with a gray, slushy ice that clogged the docks and trapped ships. Their sails furled against a cold that seemed to sap the very will from the air. Inside the palace, the court adapted to the new rhythm of their sovereign, a rhythm set to a slower, colder beat. The great fireplaces in the hall were kept roaring with immense logs, yet a perpetual chill remained in the air, a deep-seated cold that seemed to emanate from the stone floors and seep into the bones of the courtiers, who found themselves wearing their heaviest woolens even indoors, their conversations hushed, their laughter subdued, as if the very atmosphere dampened joy and encouraged a state of watchful anxiety. The Night King, in his guise as James, held court with a disquieting stillness, his movements economical and precise, his speeches, while flawlessly mimicking the king's cadence, devoid of the man's famous humor and occasional petulance, replaced instead by a remote, glacial authority that commanded obedience not through love, but through a pervasive, low-level fear. He began to issue a series of edicts, each one seemingly rational on the surface, yet each carrying the hidden purpose of isolating England and strangling its sources of warmth and power. He imposed severe, restrictive tariffs on the import of coal and peat, citing the need to bolster domestic mining, but the true effect was to make fuel prohibitively expensive for the common people, forcing them to shiver in their homes and weakening their resistance to the deepening cold. He diverted royal funds from the maintenance of the great ironworks and forges of Sussex and Sheffield, instead commissioning a vast, mysterious project to be undertaken by stonemasons and laborers brought from the remote, northern counties, the construction of a new wing to the palace, a structure he designed himself with strange, spiraling architecture and deep cellars, a project that consumed resources and men, many of whom would return from their shifts pale and quiet, speaking of a cold in the building site that no fire could touch. The young clerk, Thomas, driven by his gnawing suspicion, became a ghost in the archives, spending every waking moment when he was not performing his duties buried in the oldest, most dust-laden manuscripts the royal library possessed. He ignored the political tracts and recent histories, seeking instead bestiaries from the time of the Vikings, Celtic myths transcribed by monks, and fragmented accounts from Roman legionaries who had marched into the northern wastes of Britain and returned with tales of spirits of ice and mist that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. His search was frantic, a race against the cold he could feel in his soul, and it was in a crumbling, water-stained codex, a copy of a far older text written in a mix of Latin and forgotten Gaelic, that he found it, a passage that spoke not of a demon, but of a sovereign of cold, a being known as the Rian Oichi Gaimrid, the king of the winter night, an entity from before the time of men, who slept in a kingdom of everlasting ice and whose awakening would be heralded not by a great battle, but by a silent usurpation, a stealing of warmth and light from within, and whose presence would make the very land mourn, bringing a winter that would never end, a winter of the spirit as much as of the body. The description of the creature's eyes, blue stars that burned with an ancient cold, and its ability to cloud the minds of men and command the elements of ice, matched exactly what Thomas had glimpsed in the king's chambers, and a terror far deeper than any fear of mere treason seized him. He was not dealing with a political coup, but with an apocalyptic invasion, and the enemy was already in absolute control of the kingdom's heart. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, the hunt for the remaining Gunpowder Plot conspirators took a sinister and unnatural turn. Robert Catesby, Thomas Winter, and their dwindling band of followers were fleeing toward Holbesh House in Staffordshire, hoping to make a final stand, but they were being hunted by something far more effective and terrifying than the king's men. The Night King, from his throne in London, had sent forth his spectral hunters, creatures he formed from the very air, shaping freezing mist and shadow into wolf-like forms with eyes of blue ice and breath that could flash freeze a man's lungs, and whispers of these hellhounds, or frost phantoms, began to spread through the villages they passed, tales of men found on the road not slain by sword or gun, but frozen solid, their faces locked in expressions of absolute terror, with no footprints in the snow around them save their own. These phantoms harried the conspirators relentlessly, not attacking in force, but picking off stragglers, appearing at the edges of forests at twilight to freeze their courage and sow panic, ensuring the group was driven, exhausted and terrified, toward a specific destination, a place the Night King had chosen for their final end, a remote valley where the cold was already deeply concentrated, where he could dispose of these last loose threads of the old reality without any witnesses. Back in London, the unnatural winter was beginning to bite deeply. Disease began to spread among the poor and the elderly, a brutal ague that the physicians could not cure, and food prices skyrocketed as the unseasonable cold killed livestock and blighted the remaining winter stores, yet the king seemed unconcerned, even pleased, often walking on the palace battlements to feel the bite of the wind. His figure outlined against the grey sky, a solitary, cold sentinel overseeing the gradual freezing of his new domain. Thomas, armed with his terrifying knowledge, knew he could not act alone. The king's will, or rather the creature's will, held the court in thrall, and to speak his theory aloud would see him branded a madman and instantly silenced. He needed proof, and he needed an ally with the power to act. He thought of one person, Queen and King James's wife, who had been keeping to her own apartments, reportedly unwell and distressed by the sudden change in her husband's demeanor. Stealing through the cold corridors, Thomas used his knowledge of the palace's lesser-known passages to bypass the guards, his heart pounding, knowing that discovery would mean a fate worse than death, a fate like the king's, trapped in ice. He found the Queen in her sitting room, huddled by a large fire that seemed to do little to push back the deep chill of the room. She looked pale and anxious, and when Thomas, after swearing her to secrecy, whispered his insane theory, he saw not disbelief, but a dawning, horrified recognition in her eyes. "He has not called for me once," she confessed, her voice trembling. "He feels different. His touch is like marble. He speaks of statecraft, but his eyes are those of a stranger. A dead stranger." She revealed her own chilling observation. The songbirds she kept in a gilded cage, creatures that usually sang every morning, had fallen completely silent the day after the plot was foiled, and had remained so, huddled together on their perch, staring in the direction of the king's chambers. This was the confirmation Thomas needed. The Queen, terrified for her true husband and her kingdom, agreed to help. Their plan was desperate. Thomas believed the Real King might still be alive, imprisoned somewhere in the vast, labyrinthine cellars of the palace, and the secret to defeating the impostor lay in the ancient text, which spoke of a vulnerability to a heart of fire, and forged iron never touched by frost. They decided that the Queen would use her position to distract the false king, while Thomas, under the cover of the deepening night and a howling blizzard that now raged outside, a blizzard summoned by the Night King's mere presence, would venture into the underground levels, a place now grown impossibly cold and dangerous, to search for the true king or for any clue that could help them fight the encroaching eternal night. As Thomas descended into the darkness, a single lantern his only source of warmth and light in the oppressive cold, the world above seemed to hold its breath. The Night King, sensing a faint disturbance in the icy serenity of his dominion, a flicker of warm defiance in the cold stone of his palace, turned his gaze from the storm outside toward the interior of his fortress, a slow, cruel smile forming on the lips of King James. For the hunt within the palace walls was about to begin, and he always enjoyed the futility of warm things trying to fight the inevitable cold. The descent of Thomas into the bowels of Westminster Palace was a journey from the known world into a realm of nightmare, a passage that seemed to cross not just physical space but the boundary between reality and some frozen underworld. The stone steps, worn smooth by centuries of servants' feet, became increasingly coated in a slick, glistening layer of hoarfrost the deeper he went, and the air, once merely chilly, grew thick and heavy with a cold that actively resisted his lantern's warmth, seeming to swallow the light and muffle sound until his own breathing and the frantic hammering of his heart were the only things he could hear in the oppressive silence. The familiar storage cellars, usually filled with casks of wine, ale, and sacks of grain, were transformed into catacombs of ice. The barrels were sheathed in crystalline cocoons, their contents frozen solid and expanded, causing some to split open like strange, frozen fruits, and the hanging sides of meat in the butcher's larder were now grotesque, rock-hard statues of ice, their forms blurred and distorted by the thick layers of rime. He moved with a terrified caution, every sense screaming that he was an intruder in a place that had been claimed by a hostile intelligence, and the further he ventured from the stairs, the more the architecture itself seemed to change, the Norman stonework giving way to older, darker passages that felt pre-Saxon, as if the Night King's influence was pulling the very foundations of the palace back into a more ancient, primeval state of cold. His lantern, his sole bastion against the consuming darkness, began to flicker and dim, its flame guttering as if starved of oxygen, and the pool of light it cast shrank, the cold pressing in on him like a physical weight, a malevolent presence that watched him from the countless shadows that danced just beyond his failing light. He was lost in a frozen maze, his original purpose of searching for the king becoming a desperate fight for survival against the environment itself, his fingers growing numb and clumsy, his thoughts beginning to slow and thicken with a dangerous lethargy that whispered for him to just lie down, to rest, to let the quiet cold take him. It was in this state of near despair, turning down a narrow passage he had never seen before, that he found it, not the king, but something else, something that confirmed the terrifying antiquity of the force they faced. The passage opened into a small, circular chamber that was not part of any palace plan, its walls made of a strange, black, vitrified stone that seemed to drink the light, and in the center of the room stood a plinth of the same material, and upon that plinth rested a single, immense, and perfectly formed shard of ice that glowed with a soft, internal, blue luminescence. This was no ordinary ice. It was clear as diamond, and within it, frozen in time, were scenes of a world before men, vast glaciers grinding over continents, strange, star-like constellations in a black sky, and at the core of the shard, a faint, dark shape that might have been a sleeping figure. This was an anchor, a focus of the Night King's power, a piece of his ancient homeland brought here and embedded in the heart of London, and it was the source of the deep, supernatural cold that was radiating through the palace foundations and seeping into the city above. As Thomas stared, mesmerized and horrified, he felt a pull from the shard, a call to touch it, to join its perfect, silent stillness, and he might have succumbed had not a sound shattered the silence, a faint, desperate, rhythmic tapping, like a stone being struck against ice, coming from a wall behind the plinth. The sound was utterly human, a signal of life and resistance in this realm of deathly quiet, and it broke the spell of the ice shard. Scrambling over, Thomas found that what he thought was a solid wall was in fact a recent, crude construction of stone and mortar, and from behind it, the tapping continued, more frantic now. Using his failing lantern as a hammer, he chipped away at the mortar, his numb hands bleeding, until a stone loosened and fell away, revealing not darkness, but a faint blue glow. Peering through the hole, he saw a sight that would haunt him forever, the true King James, trapped in a block of transparent ice just like Guy Fawkes, but fully conscious, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate hope, one hand raised, holding a small rock with which he had been feebly tapping against his own frozen prison. He was alive, aware, and had been witnessing his own imprisonment, a spectator to the theft of his life. Their eyes met through the ice, and in that moment, a silent communication passed between the monarch and the clerk, a plea for help, acknowledgement of the unbelievable truth, and a shared resolve. But this moment of discovery was also their greatest vulnerability. High above, in the royal chambers, the Night King, who had been conversing with a group of noblemen about the ongoing hunt for traitors, suddenly paused mid-sentence. His head tilted, as if listening to a distant sound. He had felt it, a disturbance at his anchor point, a warmth, however faint, touching the core of his power. The smile that had begun to form on his face upstairs vanished, replaced by a look of cold, infinite fury. The noblemen shrank back as the temperature in the room plummeted instantly, their breath pluming thickly, the wine in their cups developing a skin of ice. Without a word of explanation, the false king turned and strode from the room, his movement no longer the measured gait of James but the swift, gliding motion of a predator, leaving the terrified courtiers in his wake. The hunt was no longer a game, it was now a necessity. The Night King did not take the stairs, he simply stepped into a shadowed alcove and seemed to dissolve into the darkness, traveling through the veins of cold that now ran through his palace, reforming himself in the frozen chamber just as Thomas was desperately trying to find a way to break the king free from his ice. The arrival of the usurper was silent and instantaneous. One moment Thomas was alone with the trapped king, The next the Night King stood before the glowing shard, his own eyes burning with the same blue fire, his human disguise flickering and fading to reveal his true, terrifying form, a tall, skeletal figure of ancient ice and shadow, crowned with jagged spikes, his presence sucking all warmth and hope from the air. A little moth drawn to the coldest flame. The Night King's voice echoed in Thomas's mind, a sound like cracking glaciers. You seek to steal back that which is already mine. This kingdom. This king. His warmth is a fading memory, and you will soon be just another trophy in my gallery of silence. Thomas stood frozen, not by magic, but by sheer, primal terror, facing a being from myth and nightmare. The real King James's eyes in his prison showed pure despair. The Night King raised a hand, and the ice around Thomas's feet began to crawl upward, swift and merciless, binding him in place, a cold so intense it felt like burning, creeping past his ankles, towards his knees, set to encase him forever beside his king. This was the end. There was no fight, no contest. It was the inevitable conclusion of warmth facing the absolute cold. But Thomas, in his final moment, as the ice burned his skin, did the only thing he could think of. He threw his lantern. It was not a weapon of war, just a simple brass lantern with a guttering candle inside. It tumbled end over end, its weak flame almost dying in the air, and struck not the Night King, who would have simply extinguished it, but the ancient, glowing shard of ice on the plinth. The moment the flame, the symbol of fragile, mortal warmth, touched the core of the Night King's power, there was a sound like a mountain splitting in two. The shard did not melt, it fractured. A web of hairline cracks spread across its surface, and the blue light within flared violently, then flickered. The Night King screamed, a sound of pure, undiluted agony and rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of London, as if the fracture in the shard was a fracture in his own being. The ice creeping up Thomas's leg shattered, freeing him, and the constant, deep cold in the chamber receded by a crucial few degrees. The Night King stumbled back, clutching his chest, his form flickering wildly between his true self and the image of King James. He was wounded, not mortally, but his connection to this place, the potency of his anchor, had been damaged. The shock had broken his concentration. In that moment of stunning vulnerability, Thomas saw his chance. He didn't fight. He ran. He turned and fled back down the frozen passageway, scrambling blindly through the darkness, the enraged screams of the wounded winter monarch echoing behind him, promising a death that would be slow and exquisite. Thomas had not won a victory, but he had snatched a temporary retreat from absolute defeat. He had discovered the terrible truth, found the real king, and learned that the usurper had a weakness, a connection to ancient, frozen artifacts that could be harmed by heat and flame. He burst out of the cellar into an upper corridor, collapsing on the cold stone floor, gasping for air, his clothes frozen stiff, his body shaking uncontrollably. He had to get to Queen Anne. They had to act, and act now, before the Night King recovered and sealed his domain forever. The game had changed utterly. The silent usurpation was over. The war for England, for the very nature of reality, had now truly begun, and its first, desperate shot had been fired not with a gun, but with a single, dying candle flame. The palace, above and below, was now awake to the struggle, and the hunter, wounded and furious, would be more merciless than ever before. The fracture in the ancient ice shard was not merely a physical damage, but a psychic wound that reverberated through the entirety of the Night King's being, a screeching dissonance in the symphony of absolute cold he was conducting, and the immediate consequence was a violent, uncontrolled backlash of his power that rippled outwards from the subterranean chamber like a shockwave of pure winter. Throughout the vast complex of Westminster, the deep, creeping cold that had been a steady, insidious presence suddenly erupted into a raging, supernatural blizzard. Corridors were filled with howling winds that seemed to come from nowhere, whipping snow and ice crystals through tapestries and freezing doors shut with layers of ice inches thick, while in the great hall, the massive fireplaces were instantly smothered, their roaring flames snuffed out as if they had never been, the great logs within frozen solid and coated in a bizarre, beautiful, and terrifying rime. The court, which had been moving in a hushed, chilled stupor, was thrown into outright panic as the temperature plummeted to lethal levels in a matter of heartbeats. Noblemen and servants alike screamed and scrambled for exits that were now frozen barriers, their fine clothes offering no protection against the cold that could flash freeze the moisture in their eyes, and the air itself became difficult to breathe, each gasp a knife of ice in the lungs. This was not the calculated, gradual strangulation the Night King had planned. This was a primal, pain response from a wounded god of winter, an involuntary spasm of rage and agony that threatened to destroy his carefully constructed deception by revealing the full, horrifying extent of the power now residing in the throne room. High above, in her apartments, Queen Anne felt the change immediately. The cold, which had been a persistent chill, became an assault, the windows frosting over completely, obscuring the world outside, and the songbirds in their cage, which had been silent and still, suddenly went into a frantic, dying frenzy, beating their tiny wings against the bars before falling lifeless to the bottom of the cage, frozen instantly. She knew, with a certainty that clutched her heart, that something had happened below, that Thomas had triggered a cataclysm, and that the fragile veil of normality had been torn away. At that moment, the door to her chamber burst open and Thomas stumbled in, half frozen, his face a mask of terror and triumph, his clothes stiff with ice and his hands raw and bleeding. He collapsed at her feet, gasping out his incredible story in ragged, breathless bursts. The frozen chamber, the glowing shard, the true king alive but imprisoned, the Night King's true form, and the momentary victory of the cracked artifact. The queen listened, her own fear hardening into a steely resolve. The truth was more terrible than she had imagined, but now they had a purpose, a goal, and a weapon. Fire could hurt this creature. They had to move, and they had to rally those who could still think, who could still feel warmth, before the Night King recovered from his shock and re-established his control over the palace. Their first and only ally had to be the captain of the guard, a man named Edward Walsingham, known for his unwavering loyalty to the crown and his pragmatic, unshakable courage. Fighting their way through the chaotic, freezing hallways, using a heavy candelabra as a makeshift weapon to break thin layers of ice from doors, they found the captain and a group of his men in the guardroom, trying to make sense of the sudden, impossible storm that had engulfed the palace. Thomas, with the queen by his side, told his story again, and this time, the evidence was all around them, undeniable. Walsingham, a man not given to fancy, looked at the frozen wine jug on his table, at the ice thickening on the stone walls of his guardroom, and at the palpable, ancient malice in the air, and he made a choice to believe the unbelievable. He pledged his sword and those of his most trusted men to the Queen's service, to rescue the true king, or die trying. Meanwhile, deep below, the Night King was recovering, pulling the shards of his composure together around the core of his infinite anger. The fracture in the anchor shard had weakened him, making it harder to maintain the intricate illusion of King James for extended periods, and it had caused him pain, a sensation he had not felt in millennia. This insult, from a mere flicker of mortal warmth, demanded a response of absolute, obliterating finality. He would no longer bother with subtlety or slow conquest. He would freeze London solid tonight, starting with this palace, and bury the truth under 1,000 feet of ice. He began to gather his power, drawing the cold from the surrounding lands, from the depths of the Thames, from the very air, pulling it into himself for a single, cataclysmic burst of winter that would end this rebellion before it truly began. But his concentration was again divided. Out in the countryside, his spectral hunters had finally cornered the remaining Gunpowder plot conspirators at Holbesh House. As Catesby, Winter, and the others barred the doors and prepared for a last stand against the king's men they believed were coming, something else arrived. The temperature around the manor house dropped so suddenly that the moisture in the air turned to a falling mist of ice needles. Then the phantoms came, not through the doors, but through the walls, forms of swirling snow and shadow with burning blue eyes. The fight was not a fight, it was a slaughter. Men fired muskets, the balls passing harmlessly through the icy forms. They swung swords, which shattered against frozen hides. The phantoms simply flowed over them, their touch freezing blood and stopping hearts instantly. Robert Catesby, the plot's leader, died staring into the blue eyes of a phantom, his last thought one of utter confusion at the nature of the force that had found him. But as the last of the conspirators fell, the phantoms, acting on the Night King's will from miles away, did not disperse. They gathered the bodies, stacking them in the center of the room, and then began to merge together, forming a single, massive vortex of ice and wind above them. This vortex began to spin faster and faster, pulling the heat from the very stones of the house, and then, with a silent command from London, it unleashed a concentrated beam of absolute zero cold at the pile of bodies. There was no explosion, only an intense, silent flash of blue light. When it faded, the bodies were gone, and in their place was a new, roughly hewn obelisk of black ice, identical in essence to the shard in the palace cellar. This was the Night King's response to the attack on his anchor. He was creating new ones, building a network of power nodes across England to amplify his strength and make him immune to any single point of failure. The storm at Westminster was the birth pang of this new, more aggressive strategy. Back in the palace, Thomas, the Queen, and Captain Walsingham formulated a desperate plan. They could not face the Night King directly. His power was too great. But they could strike at his source of strength. They would split into two groups. The Queen, with half the guards, would create a diversion in the upper halls, using whatever fire they could gather, torches, oil, alcohol, to create pockets of warmth and noise, hoping to draw the usurper's attention. Meanwhile, Thomas and Walsingham, with the other half of the men, would return to the subterranean chamber. Their mission, to finish what Thomas had started. They would not try to free the king yet, that ice was too strong. They would destroy the cracked shard completely, using forge hammers and torches taken from the palace blacksmith, which had thankfully not yet been fully claimed by the cold. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only move they had. As they moved out, the palace became a battleground of elements. The Queen's group fought their way toward the throne room, lighting fires and curtains and tapestries, creating islands of flickering warmth and light that hissed and spat against the oppressive cold, the flames struggling to survive but providing a powerful symbolic resistance. The noise of their passage, the shouts of men, and the crackle of fire did indeed draw the Night King's fury. He emerged from the lower levels into the main palace, and his appearance was now only partly that of James. His skin was translucent, showing the blue ice beneath, and his eyes blazed openly. He moved through the halls, and where he pointed, the fires were extinguished, and the men holding torches were frozen where they stood, becoming icy statues in poses of attack. He was a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. Below, Thomas and Walsingham reached the chamber. The cracked shard still pulsed with its damaged light. The real King James, seeing them, began tapping frantically again against his prison, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and warning. The men didn't hesitate. They swung the heavy iron hammers. The first blows rang out against the ice shard with a sound like a great bell tolling, and each strike caused the Night King above to flinch, a ripple of pain disrupting his magic. They swung again, and cracks spread. They applied torches, the heat making the ice sizzle and steam, the first real steam any of them had seen in days. With a final, collective blow from the guards, the ancient shard shattered into 1,000 pieces. The blue light exploded outwards and then died. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The supernatural blizzard raging through the palace ceased. The wind died. The deep, soul-crushing cold lifted by several critical degrees, back to the level of a severe, but natural, winter storm. The screams of the Night King from the floor above were not of pain this time, but of pure, undiluted rage. His connection was severed. His power was halved. He was trapped, for now, within the stone walls of the palace, his influence over the outside world drastically reduced. The silent usurpation had failed. The war was now loud, and it was here. Thomas and Walsingham had won a major victory, but as they stood panting in the suddenly quieter cold, surrounded by the glittering fragments of broken ice, they knew what was coming. They had enraged a god. And now, that god was coming for them, and he would have no more patience for games. The battle for Westminster Palace had begun, a conflict not of musket ball and blade alone, but of fundamental essence, a primal struggle between the dying embers of warmth and the advancing, absolute silence of the frozen void, and the shattering of the ancient ice shard had not signaled an end, but rather the end of the beginning, transforming the palace from a silently occupied territory into a violently contested battlefield where every corridor, every chamber, every stone would be fought. For with a desperation born of the understanding that there was no retreat, no surrender, only victory or an eternity of icy oblivion. The cessation of the supernatural blizzard was not a relief but a moment of eerie, breathless calm, the eye of a hurricane where the air still crackled with a malevolent potential, and in that sudden quiet, the enraged scream of the Night King echoed not just through the stone, but through the very minds of everyone left alive in the palace, a psychic shriek of pure, undiluted hatred that promised a vengeance beyond any mortal comprehension. He was no longer concerned with deception, with subtlety, with the slow and patient corruption of a kingdom. His purpose was now singular and brutally simple, the complete and utter annihilation of every single warm-blooded creature within the walls of Westminster, starting with the clerk and the guardsman who had dared to defile the heart of his power. The flickering remnants of his Jamesian disguise were now completely abandoned, shed like an unwanted skin, and his true form, a towering, skeletal specter of primordial ice, his flesh like cracked blue glacier, his eyes blazing beacons of cold hatred, and a crown of jagged, weeping icicles forming upon his brow, was now fully revealed as he began his methodical, unstoppable march from the great hall towards the subterranean chambers, his mere presence causing the air to solidify ahead of him, forming glittering, razor-sharp frost patterns on the walls and ceilings, and his footsteps did not echo but were absorbed by the deepening cold, a silent herald of death approaching. Thomas, Captain Walsingham, and a handful of guards in the chamber with the shattered shard felt the shift in the atmosphere more than heard it. The quality of the cold changed from a passive, environmental state to an active, hunting force, a sentient malice that sought out their warmth with a terrifying intelligence, and they knew, with a certainty that chilled them deeper than any winter wind, that he was coming for them. "Bar the passage!" Walsingham roared, his voice sounding thin and fragile in the consuming silence, and the men sprang into action, heaving a massive, half-frozen oak barrel that had once held wine but was now a solid block of ice, using their hammers as levers to wedge it into the narrow entrance of the chamber, a pathetic, hopeless barricade against a force that could freeze stone itself. Their only advantage was time, the minutes it would take the Night King to traverse the frozen labyrinth, and a newfound knowledge. His power was tethered to objects, to anchors, and while the primary shard was destroyed, its essence was a contagion that had seeped into the palace, and they had to find and break any other concentrations of his power before he could reach them, or else he would simply regain his strength and overwhelm them. Thomas's eyes fell upon the real King James, still trapped in his block of ice, his eyes wide with a frantic urgency, and he was not tapping randomly, but pointing, with a subtle movement of his frozen fingers, towards the wall behind his prison, the same wall Thomas had broken through to find him. "There's more," Thomas gasped. "He's pointing! There's something else in there!" Abandoning the barricade, they rushed to the wall and began to tear at the mortar with their bare hands and tools, their desperation giving them strength, and as stones clattered to the floor, they revealed not another room, but a small, hidden niche, and within it, not a weapon, but a book. It was massive, bound in a strange, grey leather that felt like petrified skin, and its pages were not parchment but thin, delicate sheets of ice that somehow did not melt, etched with runes and symbols that swam before the eyes, a grimoire of the deepest winter, a record of the Night King's power and his vulnerabilities. This was the true treasure, the reason he had imprisoned the king here, to guard it or to be consumed by it. As Thomas carefully lifted the book, a wave of visions assaulted his mind, scenes of a green, vibrant earth being scoured by glaciers, of civilizations of men falling to silent winters, of the creation of the anchor shards, and crucially, a weakness. The magic that sustained the Night King and his artifacts, while powerful, was a static magic, a magic of preservation and stillness. It could be shattered by force, but it could be unmade by a specific, countervailing magic, the living, roaring, chaotic essence of a forge fire that had been blessed by a king's touch, a fire that represented not just heat, but creation, industry, and human spirit, the absolute antithesis of his stagnant cold. They needed to get to the palace blacksmith's forge. It was their only hope. Up above, Queen Anne's diversion had become a full-scale rebellion. The sight of the Night King's true form had broken the spell of fear over many of the remaining courtiers and guards. Panic had turned into a desperate, fighting retreat. They were falling back through the palace, using furniture and tapestries to create fiery choke points, knowing it would only slow him down, but buying precious seconds for the team below. The queen herself, showing a courage that belied her delicate appearance, wielded a silver candelabra like a mace, smashing the icy statues of her former courtiers, as if freeing their souls, her tears freezing on her cheeks. The Night King moved through their resistance like a winter gale through dead leaves. He didn't bother fighting them individually, he simply exhaled, and a wave of cold would flash freeze a whole corridor, turning the brave men and women into permanent monuments to their own defiance. He was a sculptor of ice, and his medium was living flesh. His focus, however, remained absolute: the traitors in the cellar. He reached the passageway to the chamber to find it blocked. He didn't smash the barrel. He simply laid a hand on it, and the ancient oak, already frozen, crystallized and then dissolved into a pile of glittering, snow-like dust. He entered the chamber to find it empty, save for the trapped true king and the gaping hole in the wall where his grimoire had been. His rage was so immense it manifested physically. Spikes of ice erupted from the walls and floor around him, and the temperature dropped to a point where the very air began to liquefy and fall as a gentle, deadly rain of nitrogen. They had taken his book. They knew his secrets. This could not be allowed. He would not just kill them now. He would devour their warmth, absorb their life force, and use it to fuel his next, more terrible act. He turned his attention to the real King James in his prison, a cruel idea forming. He would not just leave him as a trophy. He would use him as a weapon. He placed his hands on the ice block, and began to pour his malice into it, not to strengthen the prison, but to corrupt the king within, to twist his soul and turn his living essence into a new, terrible kind of anchor, a shard of frozen despair that would radiate hopelessness and amplify the Night King's power 100-fold. The king's eyes, which had held hope and desperation, now began to cloud over with a familiar, awful blue light. He was being remade from the inside out. At that moment, Thomas, Walsingham, and their men were fleeing through a servant's passage, heading for the ground level and the blacksmith's forge, which was located in a lower bailey outside the main keep. The book in Thomas's arms was agonizingly cold, sapping his strength, whispering temptations of power and promises of a painless end if he would just stop, just rest, just give in to the beautiful cold. He clutched it tighter, its icy pages burning his hands, the pain keeping him focused. They burst out of a side door into the central courtyard, and were met by a scene from hell frozen over. The Queen's forces were making their last stand here, clustered around bonfires made from broken carts and furniture, holding back the advancing cold with sheer, desperate heat. The Night King's lesser phantoms, wolf-like forms of ice and shadow, circled the firelight, darting in to drag a guardsman screaming into the darkness where his screams were abruptly cut off. Above it all, the sky was a swirling vortex of black cloud and greenish aurora, a testament to the Night King's corrupted power. "To the forge!" Walsingham bellowed, and they fought their way across the courtyard, a desperate spearhead aiming for a low stone building from which a faint, hopeful glow emanated. The blacksmith, a giant of a man named John, was still there, keeping his forge fire alive against all odds, beating back the cold with hammer and bellows. They slammed the doors shut behind them. The forge was an oasis of warmth, the air shimmering with heat from the colossal fire, the coals a blazing heart of orange and white. The blacksmith stared at them, his face grimed with soot and sweat, his eyes wide at their tail. Thomas laid the ice book on the anvil. "We need to destroy it," he said, his voice hoarse. "And we need a weapon. A king's touch in a forge fire. He's corrupting the real king. We have to stop him." Understanding dawned on the blacksmith's face. He looked at the Queen, who had followed them in. "Your Grace, your signet ring. The royal seal." The Queen, without hesitation, pulled off a heavy gold ring bearing the lion rampant of Scotland. The blacksmith took it with a reverence. "Aye. The king's touch." He took a simple iron hammerhead, and using tongs, he placed the ring upon it. Then, he prayed not to God, but to the spirit of the fire, to the heat of creation, and he thrust the hammerhead and the ring deep into the hottest part of the forge, into the white-hot heart of the coals. As the royal gold began to melt and fuse with the iron, a change came over the fire. It roared higher, not with smoke, but with a clear, intense, golden light, a heat that felt pure and righteous, a warmth that pushed back the oppressive cold at the door, making the ice on the windows sizzle and steam. The ice book on the anvil began to react, its pages curling and smoking, the runes screaming silently as they faded. Outside, in the courtyard, a new sound joined the howl of the wind and the cries of battle, the sound of the Night King's roar of pain and fury. The corruption of the true king had been interrupted. The creation of this new, blessed heat was a wound to him. He was coming. The final confrontation would not be in a cellar or a courtyard. It would be here, in the last forge fire in London, where the weapons of the final stand were being forged in a fire touched by the soul of the kingdom itself. The door to the forge began to frost over, then crack, then splinter. The Night King had arrived. The door to the forge began to frost over, then crack, then splinter, and with a sound that was less an explosion and more a profound, localized death of matter, the heavy oak door ceased to be, its particles flash frozen into absolute stillness before shattering into a million crystalline motes that hung in the air like a malevolent glittering mist, revealing the towering, terrible form of the Night King framed in the doorway, his presence an avalanche of cold that physically pushed against the blessed heat of the forge, causing the roaring golden flames to gutter and dim as if in fear, and the very air in the smithy screamed in protest at the conflict of these two absolute opposites. He did not simply step inside. The winter flowed in around him, a tidal wave of hoarfrost that raced across the stone floor, climbing the walls, seeking to extinguish the heart of fire that dared to defy him, and his eyes, those twin blue stars of infinite cold, fixed not on the terrified men, not on the queen, but on the anvil where the ice-bound grimoire lay smoking and on the forge where the hammerhead, now glowing with a fusion of royal gold and pure iron, was being transformed into something that posed a true threat to his existence. This was no longer about vengeance for a slight. This was an existential battle for primacy, the ancient enemy of all life confronting the very symbol of creation and industry, and the Night King understood the danger on a primal level, a danger he had not faced since the earliest days of the world when the first fires of the first men pushed back the edges of his eternal ice. He raised a clawed hand, and a spear of pure, black ice formed from the moisture in the air, a weapon so cold it distorted the light around it, and he hurled it not at the people, but at the forge itself, aiming to quench the fire at its source and drown this rebellion in darkness forever. Time seemed to slow, the spear flew true, a shard of death aimed at the heart of their hope, but Captain Walsingham, with a courage that would be sung of for 1,000 years, did the only thing he could. He threw himself into its path, his body intercepting the projectile. There was no impact of metal on flesh. The spear passed through his breastplate, his torso, and out his back without a sound, and in the instant it touched him, every ounce of warmth, every spark of life, was siphoned from his body, leaving behind not a corpse, but a perfect, detailed statue of ice, his face forever locked in an expression of determined sacrifice, his sword still raised as if to parry. The spear, its energy slightly dissipated, continued on and struck the brickwork of the forge, exploding in a shower of ice shards that coated the area in a thick rime but failed to extinguish the core fire, which now blazed with a renewed fury, as if fed by the captain's courage. The queen screamed, a sound of anguish and rage, and Thomas felt a surge of despair so profound it nearly broke him, but the blacksmith, John, roared, "Now!" And with his great tongs he pulled the hammerhead from the forge. It was not merely red hot, it was a thing of beauty and power, glowing with a brilliant, white gold light, the melted royal seal having formed a golden vein that pulsed with the captured essence of kingship and fire. The heat it radiated was a tangible force, pushing back the encroaching frost, creating a small circle of warmth and light in the face of the advancing night. The Night King recoiled a half-step, a hiss of pure hatred escaping his frozen lips. This weapon could harm him, could unmake him. He focused his will, and the temperature in the smithy dropped again, the walls becoming sheets of solid ice, the ceiling dripping with long, dagger-like icicles that began to fall like deadly rain, forcing the survivors to duck and weave. The ice grimoire on the anvil, reacting to the proximity of its master and the blessed weapon, began to reconstruct itself, the smoking pages smoothing out, the runes re-etched by an unseen, freezing hand. If it was fully restored, the Night King's power would be cemented, and all would be lost. Thomas, acting on an instinct he didn't understand, grabbed a heavy, ordinary sledgehammer from the wall. He knew he couldn't wield the blessed hammer. That was for a warrior. His job was the book. As the blacksmith John advanced toward the Night King, swinging the glowing hammer in a wide arc that forced the entity to retreat from its sheer radiant heat, Thomas brought the sledgehammer down on the ice book with all his might. The impact was tremendous, a sound like a mountain cracking, and a shockwave of blue energy erupted from the book, throwing Thomas backward against the wall, his arms numb with cold. But the book held, a single new crack appearing on its cover. It was resisting. It was a part of him. The Night King, enraged by the attack on his essence, ignored the blacksmith for a moment, and gestured toward Thomas. The air around Thomas thickened, and he felt the same terrifying cold that had claimed Walsingham begin to creep into his bones, starting at his feet, crawling up his legs, a feeling of infinite stillness and silence that promised an end to all pain, all fear. He was freezing, his body locking up, his vision narrowing. From his position on the floor, his eyes met those of the Queen. She was unarmed, seemingly helpless, but her gaze was not one of defeat. It was one of furious, royal defiance. She saw the tools of the smithy around her. She saw a large vat of quenching oil, used to temper steel, sitting near the forge, still liquid because of the ambient heat. And she saw a plan. As the blacksmith engaged the Night King in a desperate dance of death, each swing of the glowing hammer causing the Night King to dematerialize and reform elsewhere in a swirl of snow, each missed blow crashing into the ice-covered walls and sending steam and shards flying, the Queen acted. She grabbed a long iron rod, heated one end in the forge until it was cherry red, and then, with a strength born of desperation, she tipped the entire vat of oil over, sending a wave of slick, flammable liquid rushing across the floor towards the Night King. The oil flowed around his feet, and before he could comprehend her intent, she thrust the hot iron into the pool. The oil ignited with a terrifying whoosh, not a simple fire, but a wave of rolling, hungry flame that raced across the floor, engulfing the Night King in a shroud of fire. For the first time, he screamed in true agony. This was not the pure, blessed heat of the hammer, but a chaotic, consuming, mortal fire, and it burned. It did not melt him, but it scorched the essence of his being, the smoke and flames clinging to his icy form, causing him to writhe and thrash in a blind rage. The hold on Thomas broke, the ice receding from his legs as the Night King's concentration shattered. The ice book on the anvil shuddered, its cracks multiplying. This was their chance. The blacksmith saw his opening. As the Night King battled the clinging flames, John the Smith charged, the blessed hammer held high above his head, its light blazing like a small sun, and with a cry that echoed the captain's final defiance, he brought it down upon the Night King's chest. The impact was not physical, it was a cataclysm of opposites. A sound like the end of the world filled the smithy, a deafening roar of steam and shattering ice. A flash of white gold light mixed with an eruption of blinding blue energy consumed everything. Thomas and the Queen were thrown from their feet. The walls of the smithy shook, and great chunks of ice and stone fell from the ceiling. When the light and steam cleared, the Night King was on his knees, a massive, smoking, molten crater in his chest where the hammer had struck. The blue light in his eyes flickered erratically, like a guttering candle. He was wounded, grievously so. His form was unstable, flickering between his terrible majesty and a withered, ancient core of black ice. But he was not destroyed. With a final, immense effort of will, he gathered the remnants of his power. He could not win this fight now. Not with that weapon here, not with his anchor book damaged, not with these mortals understanding how to fight him. He needed to retreat, to heal, to find a new source of power. He looked at them all, the Queen, the clerk, the blacksmith, and his gaze was a promise of a return. Then, he did not run or walk. He dissolved. His body fractured into 1,000 shards of ice that then exploded outward, not as weapons, but as a blinding, painful blizzard that filled the smithy, forcing them to cover their eyes. When they could see again, he was gone. The cold began to recede, not vanished, but lessened, retreating like a tide going out. The unnatural storm above the palace began to break up. The battle was over. They had survived. They had won the palace back. But as they looked around at the devastation, the ice statues of their friends, the molten crater in the floor, the smoking, cracked grimoire on the anvil, they knew it was a Pyrrhic victory. The Night King was wounded, but he was out there somewhere in England, his physical form perhaps broken, but his consciousness alive, his purpose unchanged. And he now knew his enemies. He would regroup. He would find another place of cold power. He would create new anchors. And he would return, wiser, angrier, and more determined than ever to plunge the world into his eternal night. Their reprieve was temporary. The war was far from over. It had simply entered a new, more dangerous phase. They had slain a monster in its lair, but now the monster was loose in the world. Thomas picked up the blessed hammer, its light now dimmed but still warm, still potent. It was no longer just a tool, it was a symbol. It was their only hope. They had to find him before he could regain his strength. The hunt for the Night King had begun, a pursuit that would stretch the very fabric of reality and test the limits of human courage against an enemy that was less a creature and more a force of nature, a wounded, vengeful god of winter who had been forced from his stolen throne but who now, unshackled from the confines of a single location, posed a far greater and more insidious threat as he seeped into the forgotten cold places of the world like a poison into the bloodstream of the land. The immediate aftermath within the blacksmith's forge was a scene of both victory and profound loss. The retreat of the unnatural cold was palpable, a lifting of a suffocating weight from the air that allowed the natural, though still bitter, winter chill to return, and with it, the first sounds of a world tentatively returning to life. The drip of melting ice from the ravaged roof, the crackle of the forge fire burning cleanly once more. The ragged, exhausted breaths of the survivors. Queen and knelt by the icy statue of Captain Walsingham, her hand resting on the frozen shoulder of the man who had given his life without hesitation, her tears now flowing freely, no longer freezing on her cheeks, a testament to the hard-won warmth, while the blacksmith, John, leaned heavily on his anvil, his massive frame trembling from the adrenaline and the cosmic shock of the battle he had just fought. The blessed hammer now cool and dark in his grip, its brilliant light faded after delivering its cataclysmic blow, though it still felt warm to the touch, a dormant sun waiting to be rekindled. Thomas, pulling himself up from the floor where the blast had thrown him, his body aching and his mind reeling from the sensory overload of confronting absolute evil, first checked on the icebound grimoire. It was a ruin of its former self, a web of cracks covering its surface, the runes within blurred and illegible, its malevolent aura diminished to a faint, cold whisper. It was no longer a source of power. But it was still a key, a map to the Night King's mind and his potential vulnerabilities, and Thomas carefully wrapped it in a leather apron, knowing it was now one of their most crucial artifacts. Their first duty was to the true king. Leaving the forge, they found the palace in a state of shock, the remaining guards and courtiers emerging from their hiding places like survivors of a great disaster, their faces pale and haunted, staring at the icy statues of their comrades that dotted the hallways, grim reminders of the cost of their survival. Descending back into the now less frigid cellar, they approached the prison of King James. The block of ice was still there, but the awful blue light that had begun to cloud his eyes was gone, reverted back to the desperate, pleading awareness of the man himself. The Night King's corrupting influence had been broken by his flight. Using the blessed hammer, which, even dormant, seemed to make the ice around it become brittle and weak, John the smith carefully, reverently, began to chip away at the prison, each strike ringing with a clear, pure tone that echoed in the silent chamber. It was painstaking work, requiring the strength of a giant and the delicacy of a jeweler, but finally, with a great crack, the last of the ice shattered away and the true King James VI and I collapsed into the arms of his wife and Thomas, gasping and shivering, his body racked with tremors from his long imprisonment, his voice a raw, broken croak that could form only a single, terrified word. Cold. He was alive, he was free, but he was a ghost of himself, his mind scarred by the unimaginable trauma of being a conscious prisoner in his own frozen body, forced to witness the abomination that wore his face and laid waste to his kingdom. He would need time to heal, time they might not have. The news of the king's survival and liberation spread through the palace like a wildfire, sparking a fragile, desperate hope amongst the shell-shocked survivors. But there was no time for a prolonged celebration. In a hastily secured council chamber, with guards posted at every door and window, the king, wrapped in blankets and huddled before a roaring fire, his eyes still holding a deep, frozen horror, listened as Thomas and the queen recounted everything that had transpired. He learned of the Gunpowder plot's true fate, of the Night King's usurpation, of the battle in the forge, and of the enemy's escape. His analytical mind, famed for his scholarly works on demonology and governance, began to work despite his trauma. "He is wounded," the king whispered, his voice gaining a sliver of its old authority. "A wounded animal seeks its den. A wounded god will seek a place of power to heal. He will not stay in the south. He will go north. To the oldest cold. To the places where the memory of ice is longest." This was their first clue. The Night King would be drawn to the ancient, wild cold of the Scottish Highlands, to the remote glens and frozen lochs where the veil between worlds was thin and the power of winter held sway. Their mission was clear. They could not wait for him to regain his strength and return with a new army of cold. They had to pursue him, to find whatever remained of his essence, and use the blessed hammer to finish what they had started. But they could not go as an army. A royal procession would be too slow, too obvious, and would terrify a population already on edge from the unnatural winter. It would be a small, secret quest. Thomas, with his knowledge of the ancient texts and his first-hand experience, would lead. John the blacksmith, the only one strong enough to wield the hammer, and the one who had forged it, would be their warrior. And the king, to the shock of all, insisted on coming. "He wore my face," James said, a fire of grim determination finally cutting through the trauma in his eyes. "He ruled in my name. He tortured my people and my queen. This is a sin against the divine right of kings itself. I will see him unmade with my own eyes, or I am not fit to wear this crown." He would not be a fighter, but his presence was crucial. His royal blood, his touch, was part of the hammer's power, and his knowledge of the northern territories and their ancient lore might be their guide. Queen Anne would remain in London, acting as regent, maintaining the fragile illusion that the king was merely recovering from a terrible illness, doing her best to rebuild a city shattered by supernatural terror, and secretly gathering any resources she could send north to aid their quest. Their preparation was a frantic race against the unseen clock of the Night King's recovery. John worked at his forge day and night, studying the cracked grimoire with Thomas, using its damaged pages to guide him. He did not reheat the blessed hammer. Its power was innate now. Instead, he forged new tools, tips for their staffs and boots that could grip ice without freezing, small pendants of iron and gold that held a sliver of the forge's warmth to ward off the lesser cold, and a special scabbard for the hammer, lined with wool and lead to contain its dormant power, and its telltale warmth from attracting the attention of any remaining ice phantoms. Thomas, meanwhile, scoured the royal archives for any and all maps of the Scottish Highlands, particularly of the most remote and myth-shrouded regions, Glencoe, Rannoch Moor, the Cairngorms, places where legends spoke of doorways to the other world and where winter never truly loosened its grip. The king, growing stronger by the hour, provided context, recalling old Scottish folk tales his mother had told him, stories of the Fear Lieth Moor, the Big Grey Man, of Ben Macdui and the Icy Bean Nye, washerwoman, seen near lonely lochs, tales he now understood were not mere superstition, but distorted echoes of the Night King's ancient presence. 3 days after the battle, they departed London under the cover of a misty dawn, disguised as a group of wool traders heading north to buy stock, their royal identities hidden beneath heavy, practical cloaks, the king's face shadowed by a deep hood. The blessed hammer was hidden in a cart, wrapped and shielded. The journey north was a traverse through a wounded land. The unnatural winter had receded, but its effects were devastating. Fields were frozen wastelands, livestock were dead in the fields, frozen solid, and the people in the villages they passed were haggard and fearful, speaking in hushed tones of the great frost, and of strange, cold mists that still clung to certain woods and hills at night, mists that were said to steal the breath from men and leave them frozen. They were following a trail of residual cold, a psychic chill that Thomas, after his exposure to the grimoire and the Night King's essence, could faintly feel, a pull towards the deepest, oldest cold. It was a faint compass, but it was all they had. After weeks of hard travel, they crossed into Scotland. The feeling intensified. The normal winter here was harsher, but this was different, a sharp, invasive cold that felt watchful. Their first true test came on the outskirts of the Trossachs. Making camp for the night, they were set upon not by bandits, but by a pack of the Night King's lesser phantoms, wolves of mist and ice, remnants of his power that had been drawn to the lingering trace of the blessed hammer. It was a terrifying fight in the dark. The creatures were immune to normal steel, but John, wielding the hammer, found that even without its full, blazing light, it could shatter them with a touch, each blow causing the phantom to explode into a harmless shower of snow. The king, armed with a dagger whose blade John had tempered in the forge fire, managed to fend one off, the warm steel actually burning the creature's mist-like form. They survived, but it was a clear message. The Night King knew they were coming. He was aware of the threat they posed, and he was testing them, trying to whittle them down with his scouts. The trail of cold grew stronger, leading them ever north and west, into the heart of the Grampian Mountains, towards the great, brooding mass of Ben Macri, the second highest peak in Scotland, a place infamous for its sudden, violent storms and its aura of primordial dread. The air grew thinner, the wind sharper, and the signs of the Night King's passage became more evident, patches of ground that never thawed, even in direct sunlight, trees sheathed entirely in ice, their branches tinkling like glass bells in the wind, and a profound, watchful silence that oppressed the spirit. They were entering his domain, the edges of his healing ground. Finally, they stood at the foot of the great mountain, looking up at its snow-shrouded peak, which was obscured by a perpetual, swirling cloud that glowed with a faint, sickly green light, the aurora of his corrupted power. The psychic chill was a constant ache in their bones now, a magnetic pull drawing them upward. Somewhere on that mountain, in a hidden quarry or a frozen lochen, the Night King was gathering his strength, feeding on the ancient cold of the land, and weaving a new body for himself, a form that would be stronger, more terrible, and utterly devoid of the weakness of his previous incarnation. He was no longer hiding in a cellar. He was rebuilding his throne in the clouds, on the roof of Scotland itself. The final ascent would be their greatest trial. They were being led into the heart of the storm, into the lair of a wounded and waiting god. The hunt was over. The confrontation was about to begin. And this time, there would be no palace walls to contain the battle, no forge fire to aid them, only the endless cold of the high mountains, the fury of a betrayed monarch, the strength of a smith, the knowledge of a clerk, and the fading warmth of a single, blessed hammer against the resurrected might of an eternal winter. The ascent of Ben Macri was not a climb but a pilgrimage into a heart of absolute desolation, a vertical journey through layers of cold that grew progressively older and more malevolent with every labored breath, the very air becoming a thin, sharp blade that sawed at their lungs and carried with it a psychic weight of ancient sorrow and boundless rage that pressed down on their minds, threatening to unravel their sanity before they even laid eyes upon their foe. The landscape was a monument to the Night King's gathering power. The rocks were not merely snow-dusted but were fused into bizarre, sculptural forms by layers of blue-tinged ice that seemed to have grown there over centuries, not days, and the wind did not howl but rather sang a low, discordant choir of whispers that spoke of forgotten ages of ice and the extinction of suns, a sound that seemed to originate from within their own skulls. The higher they climbed, the more the world of men fell away, replaced by a reality that was being slowly overwritten by the Night King's will, a preview of the eternal silence he planned for the entire earth. King James, though physically the weakest, proved to be their spiritual anchor. His scholarly mind, forged in the study of demons and theology, recognized the psychological assault for what it was, a weapon of despair, and he fought it with whispered prayers, with recited verse, and with the sheer force of his royal dignity, a tiny flicker of human order against the formless chaos of the cold. John the blacksmith, the hammer secured on his back, moved with a grim, relentless determination, his immense physical strength tested not by the climb but by the environment itself, which seemed to actively resist his every step, the ground becoming slicker, the wind pushing back more fiercely the closer they got to the peak. As if the mountain itself was a living extension of the Night King and was trying to reject this impurity of warmth and life. Thomas, his senses heightened by his exposure to the grimoire, was their compass. He could feel the subtle currents of power flowing upwards, could see the faint, ethereal trails of blue energy that snaked through the air like frozen rivers, all converging on the summit plateau, and he led them not by sight, for a perpetual, swirling mist obscured everything beyond a few feet, but by this terrible intuition. A connection to the enemy that was both a gift and a curse, making him nauseous and light-headed but ensuring they did not become lost in the white void. After hours of grueling ascent, the slope began to level out, signaling they had reached the vast, barren summit plateau. The mist here was thick as wool, visibility reduced to an arm's length, and the silence was absolute, a pressure on the eardrums more profound than any noise. The cold was no longer merely physical. It was a spiritual vacuum, sucking the hope and warmth from their very souls. Thomas held up a hand, signaling a stop. He could feel it. They were not alone. The mist was alive. Then, a sound began, a slow, rhythmic crunch, 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 of footsteps on frozen snow, approaching them from the heart of the whiteness. They drew together, back to back, John unlimbering the blessed hammer, which began to glow with a soft, reassuring golden light, pushing their tiny circle of visibility out to perhaps 10 feet. And then he emerged from the mist. The Night King. But he was not the wounded, flickering entity that had fled the forge. His time on the mountain had allowed him to heal and to change. He was larger, his form more solid and terrible. He had not merely regenerated, he had evolved. His body was now a fusion of the black ice of the mountain's core and the clear, blue glacial ice of a deeper age, giving him a layered, armored appearance that seemed both organic and mineral. His crown of icicles was now a magnificent, terrifying helm of intricate, razor-sharp ice spikes. And in his hand he held a new weapon, a great sword forged from a single, continuous shard of obsidian-like ice, its edge shimmering with a light that promised the absolute end of all heat. But the most terrifying change was in his eyes. They still burned with blue fire, but now there was a cold intelligence there, a calculating, strategic mind that had learned from its defeat. He did not attack immediately. He stopped at the edge of their circle of light and regarded them. His voice, when it came, was no longer a crackling whisper in their minds, but a clear, resonant, and deeply chilling sound that vibrated through the frozen ground. "You have come far to deliver my property," he said, his gaze fixed on the wrapped grimoire on Thomas's back. "And to return the trinket you stole. You have saved me the trouble of digging your kingdom out from the rubble. For that, I will make your endings quick." He was toying with them, exuding a confidence that was terrifying. The king stepped forward, his voice shaking but clear. "This is my land. You are not welcome here. By divine right and by the strength of my people, I banish you back to the darkness that spawned you." The Night King actually laughed, a sound like glaciers calving into a frozen sea. "Divine right? I am older than your god, little king. I was ancient when this rock was born from fire. Your right is a fleeting dream. I am the waking cold." With a gesture, the mist around them coalesced, forming a dozen perfect, mirror-image replicas of the Night King, each holding an identical icy great sword. An illusion, but one that felt utterly real, each copy radiating the same soul-crushing cold. "Let us see how your weapon fares when it does not know where to strike." The true Night King's voice echoed from all around them. The copies attacked as one. John roared, swinging the hammer in a wide arc. It passed through one illusion, which dissipated into mist, but another lunged from his blind spot, its sword grazing his arm. The touch was not mortal, but a wave of instant frostbite spread from the wound, numbing his muscles. Thomas and the king were frantically trying to fend off their own attackers with daggers and staffs, their weapons largely ineffective against the magical constructs. They were being overwhelmed not by strength, but by numbers and disorientation. Thomas, realizing the futility, closed his eyes, ignoring the phantom blades that felt so real. He reached out with that part of him that was connected to the Night King's power, feeling for the core of cold, the source. He found it, a pulsing, concentrated knot of absolute zero amidst the distracting chill of the illusions. "John! To your left! The one not moving!" he screamed. The blacksmith, trusting Thomas implicitly, turned and put all his strength into a blow aimed at the stationary Night King. The hammer flared to life, its golden light blazing like a sun. The Night King's eyes widened in surprise. He brought his own great sword up to parry. The collision of the two weapons was an event that transcended sound. A silent, expanding ring of white and blue energy erupted from the point of impact, scouring the plateau clean of mist and illusions for 100 yards in every direction. The shockwave threw Thomas and the king to the ground. John was sent stumbling backward, his boots carving trenches in the frozen ground. The Night King was forced back a single step, a sign of his immense power. The hammer had met its equal. The true battle began. It was a dance of titans. John, fueled by mortal strength and righteous fury, against the Night King, a being of ancient, limitless winter. Each blow of the hammer was met with a parry from the ice great sword, each impact creating concussive waves of force and releasing blasts of steam and ice shards. John was a master of his craft, his swings powerful and precise. But the Night King was a master of death itself, his movements fluid and utterly efficient, his sword moving with a speed that should have been impossible for its size. He was learning the hammer's rhythm, adapting. He began to use the environment, causing spikes of ice to erupt from the ground under John's feet, forcing him to dodge and breaking his momentum. Thomas and the king could only watch, helpless. This was a duel they could not interfere in. Thomas's mind raced. The hammer was a powerful weapon, but it was reactive. It countered the Night King's power, but it didn't seem to be able to destroy him, not while he was at full strength on his home ground. They needed to tip the balance. The grimoire. The king saw the look in Thomas's eyes and understood. The book. He wants it for a reason. It is a part of him. That was it. The grimoire wasn't just a book of knowledge, it was a phylactery, a repository of his essence. The Night King wasn't just healed, he had reintegrated part of himself, making himself whole and more powerful. But that also meant it was still a part of him. A vulnerability. While John dueled, trading world-shattering blows that were slowly exhausting him, his movements becoming slower, his breaths coming in ragged, frosty plumes, Thomas acted. He unwrapped the grimoire. The cracked ice pages immediately reacted to the proximity of their master, glowing with a faint blue light. The Night King, sensing it, faltered for a microsecond in his fight with John. "No!" he roared, his attention divided. This was their chance. Thomas didn't know any spells. He couldn't read the runes. But he didn't need to. He understood its nature. It was a thing of absolute cold and perfect, static order. Its opposite was not just heat, but chaos. Life. "Your Majesty! Now!" Thomas yelled. King James, understanding immediately, stumbled forward. He took the dagger John had forged for him and, without hesitation, drew the blade across his own palm, letting his royal blood, the blood that had touched the hammer, drip onto the open pages of the ice grimoire. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The living, warm, chaotic blood of a king was the ultimate blasphemy to the book's perfect order. Where the drops fell, the ice did not melt, it screamed. The runes writhed and blackened. The pages convulsed, cracking violently. The Night King screamed in unison with his book, a shared agony that made him drop his guard. John, seizing the opportunity with the last of his strength, swung the blessed hammer not at the Night King, but at the grimoire on the ground. He did not strike to destroy the book, but to transfer energy. He brought the hammer down onto the book just as the king's blood touched it. There was a flash of golden light so intense it blinded them all. The power of the blessed hammer, the living blood of the king, and the static evil of the grimoire collided. The book exploded. But it was not an explosion of ice. It was an explosion of paradox. A silent, expanding sphere of nothingness. A vacuum of both heat and cold, of order and chaos. It hit the Night King, and it unmade him. Not with fire, not with force, but with negation. He did not shatter. He did not melt. He simply came apart. His form dissolved into its constituent parts, the ancient ice, the dark mountain rock, the hatred, the intelligence, and then those parts too disassembled, fading into a million motes of blue light that hung in the air for a moment before winking out of existence, one by one. The great ice sword clattered to the ground, and then itself sublimated into mist. The oppressive weight on the mountain vanished. The whispering wind fell silent. The unnatural, green-tinged light fading from the sky, replaced by the pale, honest light of a winter sun breaking through the clouds. The Night King was gone. Truly gone. Unmade by the very essence of what he was, turned against itself. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. It was the silence of a world released from a terrible burden. They had won. They stood there, three battered, broken men on the top of the world, surrounded by the evidence of their impossible victory. The war was over. But as they began to tend to their wounds, to process their survival, Thomas looked down at the place where the grimoire had been. There was nothing left. Not a shard, not a stain. It was simply gone. And with a dawning, slow-burning horror, he realized that the explosion of paradoxical energy, the negation of such a powerful artifact, had not just vanished. It had to have gone somewhere. It had ripped a hole. A tiny, almost invisible pinprick in the fabric of reality, right there on the summit of Ben Macdui. And through it, he felt not cold, but something else. Something old. And it was watching them back. The victory was complete. But the cost, the unintended consequence, was unknown. And perhaps, far more terrifying. This new sensation was not the aggressive, consuming cold of the Night King. It was a profound, ancient stillness, a watchful patience that felt eons deep, a presence so vast and alien that it made the Night King's malice seem like a petulant child's tantrum in comparison. The hole Thomas felt was not a physical tear in the air, but a metaphysical wound, a scar left on the skin of the world from the violent unmaking of such a powerful entity, and it served as a window, or a doorway, to a place that existed in the spaces between realities, a realm of primordial silence that had been disturbed by the cataclysmic paradox they had unleashed. For a long moment, the three of them stood frozen on the summit, not from cold, but from a dread that was existential in its magnitude, their triumph over the Night King instantly rendered small and fragile by the dawning awareness that they had not merely slain a monster, but had, in the process, knocked on a door to a universe that was never meant to be opened, and something on the other side had heard the knock. The feeling passed as quickly as it had come, the pinprick seeming to seal itself, or perhaps the attention of that vast presence shifting away, leaving them with only the memory of that incomprehensible gaze and the chilling certainty that they had stumbled upon a truth about existence that humanity was not meant to know. The descent from Ben Macdui was a somber, silent journey, the physical exhaustion of their battle now compounded by a deep, spiritual fatigue. The mountain itself seemed different. The malevolent intelligence that had infused it was gone, and while the cold was still bitingly sharp, it was the honest cold of a Scottish winter, not the sentient, hateful freeze of the Night King. They returned to a world slowly beginning to heal. The unnatural winter that had gripped Britain receded with the passing of the days, the thaw revealing the devastation left in its wake, frozen crops, dead livestock, and a populace left traumatized and bewildered. Their return to London was that of ghosts returning to a world that had moved on in their absence. Queen Anne had ruled with a steady hand in their absence, maintaining the story of the king's recuperation, but the strain was evident on her face. The reunion was emotional, filled with tears of relief and the shared, unspoken horror of what they had experienced and the new, vague dread they now carried. King James, though physically recovering, was a changed man. The scholarly monarch who had written demonology was gone, replaced by a quieter, graver man who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back with an interest he could not explain. He spoke little of their quest, referring to it only as the northern business, and immediately threw himself into the massive effort of rebuilding his kingdom, perhaps hoping that the mundane struggles of governance could erase the memory of the supernatural war he had fought. Thomas was elevated to a new, secret position, the King's Royal Antiquarian, a title that gave him unlimited access to the archives and a mandate to search, not for political history, but for any and all references to the kind of power they had encountered, the nature of the void they had felt, and the ancient, watchful presence that lay beyond it. He was to build a secret library of the weird and the uncanny, a silent guard against the things that lurked in the margins of the world. John the blacksmith was knighted Sir John, granted lands, and put in charge of the royal armories, with a secret commission, to train a select group of smiths in the art of forging weapons tempered in special fires, and to begin the construction of a new, much larger royal forge, one that could, if needed, become a fortress against the cold and the dark. Life, for a time, resumed a semblance of normality. Years passed. The kingdom recovered. The events of the Gunpowder Plot and the Great Frost became legend, then history, then half-remembered folktales. The official story, meticulously crafted by King James, held that he had brilliantly uncovered the plot through his own cunning, and that the subsequent harsh winter had been a natural phenomenon. Thomas, now a man of middle age, never stopped his research. His secret library beneath Westminster grew vast, filled with forbidden texts, strange artifacts recovered from remote corners of the world, and his own meticulous notes. He became obsessed with the pinprick, the tear he had felt on the mountain. He found vague references in Qatar texts, in suppressed Gnostic Gospels, in the carvings of ancient Mesopotamian temples, and in the oral traditions of Siberian shamans. They all spoke of it in different terms: the veil, the membrane, the silence behind the world. It was described as a boundary, a layer of reality that separated the world of life and warmth from the endless, static nothingness that existed before creation and would exist after. The Night King, he theorized, had not been a creature from hell or another planet, but a being that had coalesced from the negative energy of that silent realm, a sentient manifestation of the void's desire for stillness, who had found a way to seep through a natural weakness in the veil long ago. Their battle had not been against a person, but against the fundamental force of the universe made flesh. And their victory, the unmaking using the paradoxical energy of the grimoire, had been like striking the veil itself with a hammer. It had not broken, but it had thinned. And things that lived in that silence, things that made the Night King seem simple and straightforward, had felt the vibration. Thomas's fears were proven right not with a grand invasion, but with a series of strange, seemingly disconnected events that began to occur across England, and then across Europe. It started small. A village in Yorkshire reported that all sound had vanished from a 2-mile radius for exactly 1 hour. Birds didn't sing, wind didn't rustle leaves, and people's voices simply wouldn't carry, creating a pocket of absolute, terrifying silence before everything returned to normal. A week later, in a market square in Norwich, every reflection in every window and puddle vanished for several minutes, showing not the world behind the viewer, but a vast, grey, empty plain under a black sky. People were found in the Scottish Highlands, frozen in place not in ice, but in attitudes of perfect stillness, their hearts beating, their lungs breathing, but their minds utterly empty, their eyes vacant, as if their consciousness had been simply deleted. They called it the stillness sickness. These were not attacks. They were leaks. Tiny, temporary ruptures in the veil, allowing the influence of the silent realm to bleed through. The presence Thomas had felt on the mountain was testing the boundaries, probing the weaknesses their battle had created. King James, now older, his health declining, summoned Thomas to his private chambers. The fear was back in his eyes, the same fear he had carried down from Ben Macdui. "It is not over, is it, Thomas?" he said, his voice frail. "We did not win. We merely exchanged one terror for another." Thomas could only nod. "The silence is stirring, Your Majesty. The Night King was a soldier. What is coming is the general. Or perhaps the entire army." The king closed his eyes. "What must we do?" Thomas had spent years preparing for this question. "We cannot fight it as we fought the Night King. We cannot kill nothingness with a hammer. We must repair the veil. We must find a way to strengthen the boundary between our world and the silence." "And how does one stitch close the wound in reality itself?" the king asked, despair in his voice. Thomas's answer was based on a lifetime of research, a theory pieced together from 100 fragmented sources. "The veil is not a physical thing. It is a spiritual and psychic barrier, woven from the energy of life, of consciousness, of memory, of sound. The Night King weakened it by feeding on those things. Our battle damaged it further through paradox. To repair it, we must do the opposite. We must create a counter-paradox. An event, or an object, of such immense creative, life-affirming power that it acts as a sealant." He proposed a grand project, a monument on a scale never before attempted. Not a fortress, not a weapon. A cathedral. But not a cathedral to any known god. It would be a cathedral of sound, of memory, of life. It would be built on the site of the blacksmith's forge where the Night King was first wounded, the place where the paradoxical energy had first been generated. Its architecture would be based on sacred geometrical principles designed to amplify positive energy. Its walls would be inlaid with fragments of every kind of rock and soil from across Britain, making it a living map of the kingdom. Its great bells would be forged from the blessed hammer, now dormant but still potent, melded with other metals, and tuned to a specific, healing frequency. And at its heart, in the great nave, would be a vast library, his library, of human experience, not just books of knowledge, but records of songs, of stories, of recipes, of love letters, of every tiny, fragile, beautiful thing that defined human life against the emptiness of the void. It would be a lighthouse of consciousness, broadcasting the signal of life into the silence, strengthening the veil through sheer, defiant existence. King James, seeing the absolute conviction in Thomas's eyes, agreed. It would be the great undertaking of the end of his reign. He provided the royal patronage, the funds, the land. He called it the King's College of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, a public-facing name to hide its true, secret purpose. Construction began. It was a project that would take decades. James did not live to see it completed. On his deathbed, his final words to Thomas were, "Make it strong. For my son. For all sons." The work continued under Charles I. Thomas, now an old man, oversaw every detail, his life's work culminating in this single, glorious, desperate act of defiance. The Cathedral of Sound rose stone by stone, a breathtakingly beautiful building, its very design a prayer against the silence. The day came for the hanging of the great bell, forged from the hammer of Sir John, who had died years before, passing his knowledge to his apprentices. The entire city of London gathered. Thomas, frail and leaning on a cane, stood beside the young King Charles. This was the moment. The bell was to be rung for the first time. Its tone would be the seal. As the bell rope was pulled, the great clapper struck the metal. But the sound that emerged was not a single, pure note of healing. It was a discordant, awful shriek that tore through the air, a sound that was somehow both incredibly loud and a profound absence of sound. The bell, forged from the weapon that had unmade the Night King, infused with the energy of the paradox, did not heal the veil. It resonated with the damage that was already there. In the sky above London, the clouds parted not to show the sun, but to reveal a vast, grey, empty expanse. The reflections in the windows of the new cathedral did not show the crowd. They showed that same endless, silent plain. And standing in the doorway of the great cathedral, formed from the converging distortions of light and sound, was a figure. It was not the Night King. It was tall, impossibly thin, and grey. It had no face, no features, only a smooth, blank expanse where a face should be. And it held in its hand a single, perfect, silent bell. It was the opposite of everything the cathedral was meant to be. It was the antithesis. The soundless one. The general of the silence had arrived. It did not move. It did not attack. It simply stood there, and as it stood, the world around it began to grow quiet. The crowd's panic became muted, then silent. The colors of the world began to drain away to gray. It was not spreading cold. It was spreading nothing. The Cathedral of Sound, designed to be a bastion of life, had instead become a beacon for its opposite. It had not sealed the wound. It had torn it wide open. Thomas fell to his knees not in prayer, but in utter despair. His life's work, his grand solution, had been the very thing that ushered in the end. They had not been repairing the veil. They had been building a doorway. And now, something had finally stepped through. The war was over before it had even begun. The true enemy was here. And it had no interest in freezing the world. It simply wanted to turn it off. The arrival of the antithesis was not an event. It was an unevent, a subtraction from reality so profound that the human mind could not initially process it, recoiling in instinctual horror from the absolute nullity it represented. The figure stood in the cathedral doorway, a statue of featureless gray stone that was somehow more alive in its utter stillness than any moving thing, and its influence radiated outwards in a slowly expanding sphere of silence and monochrome, a wave of erasure that consumed the vibrant chaos of life and replaced it with a sterile, static perfection. The panic of the crowd, which should have been a deafening roar, became a muted, silent film. Mouths opened in screams that produced no sound, people running in slow motion as the very air thickened, leaching away not just noise but kinetic energy, their movements becoming sluggish and effortful as if they were struggling through invisible syrup. The brilliant colors of their clothing, the banners, the sky, everything within 100 yards of the cathedral began to fade, bleached of hue and saturation until the world was rendered in shades of gray, black, and white, a lifeless photograph of itself. This was not the aggressive, flash-freezing conquest of the Night King. This was a gentle, inexorable smothering, a return to a state of being before creation, a silence so complete it felt like the universe holding its breath forever. Thomas, on his knees, felt the despair not as an emotion, but as a physical law, a certainty that this was the inevitable and correct end of all things, and that resistance was a foolish, temporary spasm in the face of eternal peace. The young King Charles, who had expected to consecrate a monument to his father's legacy, stood paralyzed, his mind refusing to accept the sensory deprivation assaulting it, his royal training offering no protocol for the end of reality itself. The antithesis took a single, silent step forward. Where its foot touched the ground, the cobblestones did not crack or ice over. They simply became smooth, featureless gray slabs, their history, their texture, their very identity erased into bland uniformity. This was its purpose, not to destroy, but to simplify, to reduce the complex, messy miracle of existence into a silent, still, and effortless nothing. It was the universe's desire for equilibrium made manifest, the ultimate entropy, and it had come to collect a debt that had been called due the moment Thomas and his allies had torn the veil on Ben Macri. But within Thomas, the old scholar who had faced the Night King and lived, a spark of that former defiance ignited. This was not the cold, which could be fought with fire. This was silence, which had to be fought with sound. This was stillness, which had to be fought with movement. This was nothingness, which had to be fought with everything. With a gargantuan effort of will that felt like trying to lift a mountain with his mind, he fought against the oppressive apathy, against the whispering lure of the quiet end. He forced his old, tired lungs to draw in a breath, and he screamed. It was not a scream of fear, but a pure, ragged life, a denial of the silence, a refusal of the void. The sound that came out was pitifully small, strained, and thin, immediately swallowed by the consuming quiet, but it was a sound. It was a start. The antithesis, for the first time, showed a reaction. Its smooth, head-like featureless orb tilted a fraction of an inch in Thomas's direction. It was not anger or annoyance. It was the curiosity of a mathematician noticing a single, inconsistent variable in a vast, perfect equation. This anomaly of noise required correction. It began to move towards Thomas, its pace still slow and deliberate, its passage leaving a widening trail of gray, silent world in its wake. King Charles, seeing the ancient scholar make his stand, found his own courage. He was not a warrior like his father's captain, nor a scholar like Thomas, but he was a king, and a king's duty was to lead. He drew his ceremonial sword, a useless gesture against such a foe, but a powerful symbol. He turned to the few guards who had not been frozen in place by fear or the slowing effect, their faces pale with a terror they could not even scream. "Sound the alarm!" Charles yelled, his voice sounding bizarrely loud and sharp in the muffled world, a crack in the silence. "Ring every bell! Beat every drum! Make noise! For God and for England, make noise!" The command, so simple, so human, broke the spell of despair. The guards, clinging to the familiar order, stumbled into action. One found a discarded halberd and began beating it against a metal shield, creating a loud, clanging rhythm that was horribly discordant but beautiful in its defiance. Another ran to a church nearby, not the cathedral, and began pulling on the bell rope, and a moment later, a deep, resonant bronze toll cut through the dead air, a sound of normalcy and faith that pushed back the edge of the gray sphere for a precious few feet. The effect was immediate. The antithesis paused again. The sound was an irritant, a flaw in its perfect silence. The fading of colors around the edges of its influence slowed, and the terrifying muting of sound receded slightly wherever the bell toll echoed. They had found a weapon. Not a weapon to kill, but to hold back. To create pockets of reality where life could still exist. Thomas struggled to his feet, his mind racing, the scholar overriding the soldier. The Cathedral of Sound had failed because it had tried to match the antithesis's scale, and in doing so, had resonated with the tear in the veil. They didn't need a grand symphony. They needed a cacophony. They needed the messy, unpredictable, glorious noise of life itself. "Your Majesty!" Thomas croaked, his voice raw. "It is not one big sound. It is all the small sounds. We must wake the city. We must make London itself into the bell. King Charles understood. He began barking orders, sending runners, those who could still move with purpose, in every direction. Go to the markets. Have them clash pots and pans. Go to the prisons, have the inmates rattle their bars. Go to the schools, have the children shout and sing. Go to the docks, have the ships sound their horns. Now! The command went out. And London began to fight back. It started in pockets. A cobbler in Cheapside, confused but obedient to the king's messenger, began hammering on an anvil for no reason other than to make a racket. A fishwife in Billingsgate started shouting her wares at the top of her lungs, her voice a familiar, grating sound of life. A group of apprentices, thrilled by the madness of it, began ships on the Thames, receiving the signal flags, began to blow their foghorns, deep, mournful blasts that echoed across the water. People leaned out of their windows, banging shutters, blowing horns, yelling to their neighbors. The city, so recently victim to an unnatural winter, now erupted in a spontaneous, desperate festival of noise. The effect on the antithesis was profound. The wave of gray silence halted its advance. Where the waves of sound hit it, the monochrome world seemed to flicker, tiny specks of color and hints of sound bleeding back through for fleeting moments. The entity itself seemed to become less substantial, its form wavering like a mirage. It was not being hurt, but it was being confused. Its perfect, simple equation was being flooded with millions of illogical, unpredictable variables. It could not simplify what was so determined to be complex. It took a step back towards the cathedral doorway. Then another. The silent bell it held vanished from its hand. The battle was not won. The tear in the veil was still open, a wound in reality behind it in the cathedral. The antithesis was not defeated. It was merely thwarted for the moment, unable to process the overwhelming data of an entire city screaming its existence into the void. But it would not leave. It stood its ground at the threshold, a patient, endless sentinel of silence, waiting. It would wait for the noise to stop. It would wait for the people to grow tired. It would wait for a moment of quiet, and then it would begin its work again. It had eternity. London did not. King Charles, his face smudged with dirt, his fine clothes torn, stood beside Thomas, watching the gray figure hold its position. The din around them was incredible, a physical wall of sound that was already beginning to strain voices and break instruments. "How long can we keep this up?" the king shouted over the roar. Thomas looked at the determined, terrified faces of the Londoners around him, making noise not because they understood, but because their king had asked it of them. "We have to forever, your majesty," Thomas replied, his voice filled with a new grimace. "Or until we find a way to close that door. We have just declared that the price of our continued existence is eternal, unwavering noise. We have to learn to live in a world that never, ever falls silent. For if it does, even for a second, it will be the last sound any of us ever hear." The standoff had begun. London had become a city under siege, not by an army of men, but by a concept, and its only defense was to constantly, loudly, defiantly proclaim that it was alive. The first night was the longest of Thomas's life, as he and the king organized shifts of noisemakers, ensuring the cacophony never dropped below a certain threshold. It was a desperate, exhausting strategy, a holding action against the end of everything. And as the sun rose on a weary, hoarse, but still vibrant London, Thomas knew their real work was just beginning. They hadn't won. They had simply managed to stop the clock. And they had to find a way to fix it before the battery of human spirit ran out. The silent war had begun. A conflict unlike any other in human history, a siege against the very concept of existence fought not on fields of battle but on the shifting, fragile front lines of sound and silence, a desperate, grinding struggle where victory was measured in decibels and defeat would be a quiet, gray, and absolute extinction. London became a city transformed, its very identity rewritten by the necessity of its defiance. The familiar sounds of commerce, industry, and life did not cease, but were now underpinned by a constant, mandated, foundational din, a civic heartbeat that could not be allowed to falter for even a moment. King Charles I, thrust into a role for which no monarch could ever be prepared, proved himself a leader of immense resilience, organizing the city's defense with a meticulous, almost fanatical attention to detail. The city was divided into districts, each with a designated, sound captain, a role filled by everything from retired army sergeants to charismatic pub owners, whose sole duty was to ensure their sector maintained the agreed-upon level of acoustic energy at all times. Rotas were established for teams of clangers, citizens who worked in shifts, their sole job to create noise using a vast array of instruments, not just bells and drums, but screeching saws dragged across metal, vast sheets of tin shaken like thunder sheets, teams of men rhythmically pounding hammers on anvils placed on street corners, and choirs of children trained to sing simple, repetitive rounds in overlapping, constant shifts. The Thames became a crucial strategic asset, its fleet of ships commandeered as floating sound batteries, their horns blasting at random intervals day and night, creating a wall of deep, mournful sound that rolled over the river and into the city. The economic life of the capital was bent entirely towards this single purpose. Foundries and blacksmiths worked triple shifts, not for weaponry, but to produce more noisemakers, while food and supplies were rationed and distributed based on a citizen's contribution to the city's sonic defense. It was a surreal, exhausting way to live, a constant, nerve-shredding pressure where a dropped beat, a broken drumhead, or a moment of collective fatigue could, in theory, mean the end of everything. At the heart of this frantic activity, just beyond the silent, grey boundary surrounding the cathedral, a permanent command post was established. From here, King Charles and now ancient Thomas, his body frail but his mind sharper and more focused than ever, directed the effort. Their primary observation was the antithesis itself. The entity never moved from the cathedral doorway. It stood, its featureless form a hole in the world, its presence a constant drain on reality. They quickly learned the rules of their bizarre conflict. The entity's sphere of influence was not static. It pulsed. In times when the city's noise was at its peak, unified and powerful, the grey silence would recede, sometimes pulling back almost to the cathedral steps itself, allowing color and sound to flood back into the immediate area, though the cathedral itself remained a monochrome enigma. But when the noise wavered, during the change of shifts, or when a particularly strong wave of communal despair hit the weary population, the silence would push outward again, sometimes by a few feet, sometimes by a dozen yards, swallowing the newly reclaimed ground and threatening to break through the fragile acoustic barricades. It was a constant, psychic tug-of-war. Thomas, from his command tent filled with maps of sound levels and schedules, realized with dawning horror that the antithesis was learning. It was adapting to the noise. The initial confusion was fading, replaced by a patient, analytical patience. It was beginning to identify patterns in the chaos, to find the tiny gaps and rhythms in London's defense. It was waiting for its moment with the infinite patience of the void. They couldn't keep this up forever. Human energy would wane. Resources would run out. Morale would break. The noise was a shield, but it was not a weapon. They needed a way to go on the offensive. They needed to close the tear. Thomas, surrounded by the very text he had spent a lifetime collecting, launched a new, even more desperate research project. If the Cathedral of Sound had failed because it resonated with the tear, they needed something that operated on a different principle entirely. He became obsessed with the moment of the Night King's unmaking, the paradox. They had used a paradox to create this problem. Perhaps they needed a greater paradox to solve it. His studies led him down ever darker and more obscure paths. He found fragments in pre-Celtic autumn stones and whispered tales from the indigenous peoples of the far north of America that spoke not of repairing the veil, but of patching it. The concept was always the same. A tear in reality could not be stitched closed with mundane means. It required a sacrifice of something equally paradoxical, something that embodied a fundamental contradiction of existence. One text, a scroll supposedly salvaged from the Library of Alexandria, written in a cryptic form of Greek, spoke of a heart of living stone and a tear of unending joy. Another, a carving on a piece of mammoth ivory from Siberia, depicted shamans using a mirror that shows nothing to reflect a light that casts no shadow onto a crack in the sky. These were poetic metaphors, but Thomas, in his desperation, began to see a pattern. They needed an artifact or an act that was itself impossible, a thing that defied its own nature. His breakthrough came from an unlikely source. watching the children's choirs. He saw a little girl, her voice hoarse from singing for hours, suddenly break into genuine, joyful laughter at something her friend did. The sound was pure, unfiltered, and for a moment, it seemed to cut through the industrial din with a clarity that was startling. It was a sound of life that existed not out of duty or fear, but in spite of it. And in that moment, the gray silence at the perimeter seemed to flinch. Joy. Not just sound, but positive emotion. The antithesis was negation. Its opposite wasn't just noise, it was creation, it was love, it was hope. But how could one weaponize hope? How could one forge joy into a tool? He remembered the king's blood on the grimoire. A royal life, touched by the divine right of kings, was a powerful symbol of order and legacy. But it was the blood itself, the life force, that had been the active ingredient. And he remembered the blessed hammer, forged in a king's fire. It wasn't the metal, it was the intent, the spirit poured into it. They didn't need a new object. They needed a new act. A paradoxical act. An act of pure, selfless creation performed at the very brink of oblivion. He went to King Charles with his insane plan. The antithesis simplifies, Thomas explained, his voice urgent. It reduces complexity to nothing. Our defense is complex noise, but it is wearing us down. We need to show it something it cannot simplify. We need to give it a paradox it cannot resolve. Name it, Charles said, his face grim with the weight of leadership. We will perform a play, Thomas said. The king stared at him, thinking he had finally gone mad. A play? Here. On the very border of the silence. We will build a stage. And we will perform the most joyful, the most life-affirming, the most beautifully human story ever told. A comedy. With music, and laughter, and love. We will perform it not for an audience of people, but for it. We will force it to witness the one thing it cannot comprehend, art. Art for art's sake. Beauty for beauty's sake. Joy for joy's sake. The king understood. It was a magnificent, ridiculous, utterly desperate gamble. To respond to the end of all things not with a weapon, but with a performance. It was the ultimate paradox. Preparations began in secret. The finest playwrights, musicians, and actors still in London were summoned, not told why, and sworn to secrecy. A stage was built from wood salvaged from broken-up ships, erected just yards from the creeping edge of the grey silence. The play chosen was a vibrant, silly, romantic romp filled with mistaken identities, witty dialogue, and joyful songs. The night of the performance arrived. The city's noisemakers were given their instructions. At a specific signal, they were to cease all sound for exactly 60 seconds. It was the most terrifying order ever given. For 1 minute, London would be utterly vulnerable. The silence would rush in. But in that silence, one sound would be heard, the play. The actors took their places, trembling not from stage fright, but from primal terror, performing on a stage that looked out into a monochrome, silent world, with the featureless form of the antithesis as their only audience. The king, Thomas, and the entire city held its breath. The signal was given. A single, deep bell tolled once. And then, silence. True, utter silence fell over London for the first time in weeks. It was heavier and more terrifying than any noise. As predicted, the grey silence surged forward like a tidal wave, rushing towards the stage, eager to consume the sudden quiet. And in that moment, the play began. A flute played a lively tune. An actor stepped forward and spoke the first lines, his voice clear and strong, projecting joy and humor into the void. The wave of grey silence hit the sound coming from the stage and stopped. It did not recede. It did not advance. It simply paused. The antithesis, for the first time, turned its full attention away from the city and towards the stage. It was processing. The actors, feeding off the sheer absurdity and danger of the moment, performed like never before. Their comedy was genuine, their songs filled with a desperate, real hope. They were creating something beautiful on the precipice of nothingness. The antithesis took a step forward, then another, drawn towards this impossible, illogical phenomenon. It reached the edge of the stage. It stood there, a statue of negation, watching the vibrant, colorful, noisy celebration of life. Thomas watched, his heart pounding. The 60 seconds were almost up. The entity raised its smooth, hand-like appendage, reaching out towards the lead actor, not in aggression, but as if to touch the sound, to feel this impossible thing. The actor, to his eternal credit, did not flinch. He sang directly to it, a song of love and laughter. The antithesis's form began to change. The featureless gray surface of its head began to shimmer. For a fraction of a second, the faintest impression of features appeared, a hint of eyes, a suggestion of a mouth, not human, but something trying to comprehend humanity. And in that moment, it experienced a paradox it could not resolve. It was the embodiment of silence trying to process joy. The two concepts could not coexist within it. The entity did not scream. It did not shatter. It simply unraveled. Its form dissolved into a fine, gray mist that hung in the air for a moment before dissipating into nothingness. The gray silence that had covered the cathedral, and its surroundings vanished with a soft whoosh, as if reality itself was gasping for air. Color and sound flooded back into the world with an almost painful intensity. The 60-second mark passed. The noisemakers of London, on cue, restarted their frantic din. But this time, it was different. It was not a sound of defense. It was a sound of celebration. They had won. They had not destroyed the enemy. They had presented it with a gift it could not accept, and the cognitive dissonance had unmade it. The tear in the veil, however, was still there, a wound in the air within the cathedral. But the sentinel was gone. They had bought time. Real, meaningful time. As the city erupted in joyous, disbelieving celebration, King Charles looked at the old man beside him. Thomas was weeping, tears of relief and exhaustion streaming down his face. "We did it," the king whispered. "We fought it off with a play." Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes. "We reminded the universe that we are worth the noise, Your Majesty. But the door is still open. We have shown we can defend it. Now we must find a way to close it for good." The immediate threat was over. But the work was not done. The Silent War's first battle was won, but the campaign to heal the wound they had inflicted on reality had only just begun. The disappearance of the antithesis was not a conclusion, but a profound reprieve, a single, hard-won breath drawn in the midst of a marathon whose finish line was nowhere in sight. The immediate, visceral threat was gone, but the metaphysical wound in the cathedral, the tear in the veil, remained, a silent, shimmering scar in the air that pulsed with a faint, sickly light visible only to those who knew to look for it, a constant, humming reminder of the fragility of their existence. The mandated cacophony of London did not cease with the victory. It lessened, evolving from a desperate, panicked defense into a vigilant, organized watch. The sound captains remained, their rotas now more manageable but no less critical. Their duties shifted from holding back an advancing tide to guarding a stationary, yet still lethal, breach. The city, though celebrating its deliverance, lived with the underlying knowledge that they were now the guardians of a terrible secret and a terrible door, that the constant, underlying hum of their society was all that stood between the world of life and the hungry silence beyond. King Charles I, tempered in this bizarre fire, emerged not just as a monarch, but as a singular leader for a new age, his authority now rooted in something deeper than divine right. It was rooted in the collective, traumatic memory of a people he had led back from the brink. He established a new, secret order within the monarchy, the Guardians of the Veil, with Thomas, despite his immense age, as its first High Warden. Their mandate was twofold: first, to maintain the eternal watch over the breach in the cathedral, ensuring the silence never returned, and second, to scour the earth for any knowledge, any artifact, any forgotten lore that could provide a permanent solution, a way to mend the fabric of reality itself. Thomas, his body now so frail he needed to be carried in a litter, became the beating heart of this effort. His mind, however, burned brighter than ever, fueled by a lifetime of study and the terrifying urgency of their mission. He directed teams of scholars, the brightest minds from Oxford and Cambridge, sworn to secrecy, to delve into the specific nature of the paradox they had created. The King's College of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, the failed Cathedral of Sound, was repurposed. Its vast library became the headquarters of the Guardians, its halls now filled not with students of divinity, but with researchers studying acoustic metaphysics, dimensional theory centuries ahead of its time, and the philosophy of existence versus void. The great bell, whose discordant shriek had opened the door, was taken down, its metal studied, its paradoxical energy mapped and measured. It was not just metal. It was a unique substance, a hybrid of the mortal and the divine, the chaotic and the ordered, forever changed by its role in the unmaking of the Night King and the tearing of the veil. They called it paradox iron. Thomas theorized that this same material, if understood and shaped correctly, could be the key to sealing the breach. But it couldn't be just shaped, it had to be informed. It had to be programmed with an intention. So the research continued, yielding fascinating but incomplete results. They learned to manipulate the paradox iron, finding it could be reforged, but only in a specific, resonant frequency of heat and sound, a process that required the combined efforts of a dozen master smiths and a choir singing a single, perfect note. They created small ingots of the stuff, and found that when placed near the breach, they would cause the tear to visibly calm, its sickly pulsing becoming slower and fainter. It was proof of concept. A small patch. But to seal a breach of this magnitude would require an immense quantity of paradox iron, and an intention of unimaginable clarity and power. The source of the iron was the problem. It came from the bell, and the bell had been forged from the blessed hammer, which itself had been forged from the king's signet ring and other metals. The original ingredients were gone, consumed in the creation. They could not make more. They were stuck. The solution arrived from an unexpected direction. A young, brilliant, and relentlessly curious scholar named Evelyn, one of Thomas's protégés, was studying the records of the Gunpowder plot, cross-referencing them with the accounts of the Night King's initial defeat in the palace forge. Her focus was not on the grand events, but on the small details. She became obsessed with the fate of the other conspirators, the ones hunted down by the Night King's phantoms at Holbesh House. The official record stated they had been killed in a shootout with the king's men. But Thomas's private journals mentioned the truth. They had been obliterated by a concentrated beam of cold, transformed into a new anchor of ice. An anchor that, according to the journal, should still be there. A shard of the Night King's power, untouched, waiting in a forgotten manor in Staffordshire. It was a different kind of paradox, a piece of the enemy, a thing of pure negation. But it was also a thing of power, a crystallized manifestation of the same energy that now infused their paradox iron. Evelyn took her theory to the ancient Thomas. The shard at Holbesh, it is a concentrate of the very energy we are trying to counter. But what if we don't counter it? What if we repurpose it? The paradox iron works because it holds a contradiction. What is a greater contradiction than taking the weapon of the void and turning it into the lock for the door? Thomas, his eyes clouded with age but still piercing, saw the genius of it. The Holbesh shard was not just a source of power, it was a symbolic key. Using the enemy's own weapon to seal the breach would be the ultimate paradox, a perfect, poetic closure to the conflict that had begun with gunpowder and would end with ice. An expedition was mounted. King Charles himself insisted on leading it, a symbolic journey to lay the final ghost of the plot to rest. They traveled to the now derelict Holbesh House, a place avoided by locals for the pervasive, unnatural chill that still clung to it. In the main hall, they found it, the obelisk of black ice. It was exactly as described, radiating a deep, ancient cold, and within its depths, one could still faintly see the distorted, tormented shapes of Catesby and his fellows, frozen not in water, but in absolute negation. It was a thing of pure evil. Using tools forged from their small supply of paradox iron, which resonated with the obelisk in a strange, sympathetic way, they carefully, reverently extracted it from the floorboards and loaded it onto a specially reinforced wagon. The return journey to London was tense. The presence of the shard seemed to oppress the very land they passed through, and twice they were set upon by remnants of the Night King's power, lesser phantoms drawn to their master's last great artifact. They were fought off with weapons tipped with paradox iron, which proved devastatingly effective. They arrived in London to a city holding its breath. The shard was taken immediately to the forge that had been built next to the command post by the cathedral. The greatest smiths of the realm, including the now elderly apprentices of Sir John, were gathered. Their task was unprecedented, to melt the unmeltable, to forge the unforgeable. They could not use ordinary fire. They built a new forge around the shard, its design based on Thomas and Evelyn's calculations. It was a forge fired by sound. Great horns focused the noise of the city, the bells, the drums, the shouting, channeling the chaotic, living sound of London itself and concentrating it into a beam of pure sonic energy that was trained on the black ice obelisk. For days, the shard resisted. Then, slowly, it began to change. It did not melt like metal, but rather, it softened, becoming malleable, like dark glass. Under the focused energy of London's life, the negativity within it was being agitated, forced to accept the energy of its opposite. Then, the master smiths, using tongs made of paradox iron, began to work it. They did not try to shape it into a weapon or a tool. Under Thomas's guidance, they worked to shape it into a key. A complex, intricate, and beautiful key, its teeth based on the sacred geometry Thomas had researched for the cathedral, its bows shaped like a blossoming flower, a symbol of life carved from the heart of death. The process took a month. When it was finished, the key lay on the anvil, no longer radiating cold, but humming with a quiet, stable energy. It was black and crystalline, and deep within it, tiny points of light swirled like captured stars. It was the ultimate paradox, a key made from silence, now waiting to lock the door. The day of the sealing arrived. The entire city fell silent, by order of the king. It was the first voluntary citywide silence since the standoff began. The risk was immense. But it was necessary. The key had to be applied in absolute quiet, so its own resonant frequency could harmonize with the tear and close it. King Charles, Thomas on his litter, Evelyn, and the master smith carried the key to the threshold of the cathedral. The tear was visible before them, a jagged, shimmering wound in the air, through which could still be glimpsed the vast, grey nothingness of the silent realm. There was no margin for error. In the profound quiet, the king himself took the key. Following Thomas's whispered instructions, he did not thrust it forward. He simply held it up towards the tear. The key began to glow with a soft, internal light. It lifted from the king's hand of its own accord and floated towards the breach. As it approached, the edges of the tear began to react, shimmering violently. The key touched the center of the wound. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a sound began, a single, pure, perfect note that seemed to come from the universe itself. The note held unwavering. And as it did, the tear began to heal. The jagged edges smoothed, flowing together like water closing around the key. The grey nothingness vanished from view, replaced by the normal stone of the cathedral wall. The key was gone, absorbed, become one with the mended veil. The pure note faded away, leaving behind not silence, but the normal, gentle sounds of a city holding its breath, the wind, a distant bird, the rustle of clothing. The breach was sealed. The door was closed. The eternal watch was over. A great, collective sigh seemed to rise from the entire city of London. Then, cautiously, joyfully, sound returned. But it was different. It was not defensive. It was celebratory. It was free. Thomas, on his litter, let out a long, slow breath. He looked at the spot where the tear had been, now just a wall. He looked at King Charles, whose shoulders seemed to have dropped a weight he had carried for a decade. He looked at Evelyn, the future of the Guardians. He smiled, a small, weary, triumphant smile. His work was done. The war was over. That night, as the city celebrated its true and final liberation, Thomas Aurelius, the clerk who had helped uncover a plot, faced the King of Winter, and mended the world, closed his eyes for the last time. He died not in battle, but in peace, his long, impossible task finally complete. The Guardians of the Veil remained, their watch now a vigil, their purpose now one of memory and study, ensuring that the world would never forget how close it had come to silence, and how the courage of a few had taught it to sing again. The wound was healed, but the scar remained, and the memory of the silence would echo through the ages, a whisper of what almost was, and a testament to the noise of what is.